What's up, guys? It's Ian. I'm back here with another question and answer video. Got 3 questions today. Pretty straightforward questions, so shouldn't be a long video. Before I move on, make sure you like, subscribe, drop a question in the comments below, or message me your questions directly if you don't want to post them on the public wall. First question today, I was asked, how many calories does an average person burn while walking 1 mile? So, for an average weight male of about 180 pounds, walking at 3 miles an hour for 20 minutes, that's 1 mile, they're going to burn about 100 calories. For an average American-sized female of 160 pounds, going at 3 miles an hour for 20 minutes, that's a mile, they're going to burn 89 calories. I'm about 140, so for me to walk 3 miles an hour for 20 minutes, I'm only going to burn 78 calories. There's a few other considerations to make here when looking into how many calories does somebody burn over the course of walking any given distance. Mostly economy of motion. That's going to affect how much wasted energy a person wastes as they move. So economy of motion refers to the discrepancy. The easiest way to put it is it refers to the discrepancy of how much oxygen is used versus work output created. So in general, what we see with aerobic athletes is that somebody with a lower economy of motion is going to have a higher VO2 max in order to do the same amount of actual work output, whereas athletes that we see who typically have lower VO2 max that are able to compete with athletes who are more genetically gifted in terms of their higher VO2 max, the lower VO2 max athletes will typically have a higher economy of motion, which is a good thing. It means they don't use as much energy per unit of work performed because there's less wasted energy in the system. Hopefully that makes sense. VO2 max refers to the maximum amount of oxygen a person can use per unit of time. It's usually referred to also per unit of time per minute. So VO2 max is usually measured in milliliters per kilogram of body weight per minute. That's milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute per unit time. All right. So hopefully that answers the question. People are going to burn different amounts of calories based on their body weight, but the economy of motion also ties into that. So the more efficient you become, in theory, you'll use a bit less energy to perform the same amount of work. Drop me another question in the comment section below if you need more clarification on that, and I'd be happy to go into any one of those points in greater detail. All right, question number 2. This is a straightforward question. The individual is asking, how do you select weights in a training plan? How is weight selection performed? So I generally will start a trainee off with unloaded movements or lightly loaded movements and try to coach them with optimal technique. I like to view technique as an acceptable range. I used to view technique as an extremely rigid thing, like, oh, do this or else you're gonna explode, whatever. And I don't think that type of fear-mongering is really productive when training clients. I do think significant enough deviations away from that acceptable range in combination with high amounts of training volume and loading can increase your risk of injury, but at the same time, having mild technique deviations, a couple of repetitions at a time for low volumes with lower intensities, I don't think it's going to matter as much. As you hone in on your 1 rep maxes, doing max repetition sets, basically getting higher up in your RPE scale, if you're doing consistently doing sets with a rate of perceived exertion of 9 or 10 out of 10 with poor technique and, high loading, or, moderate loading going very close to failure with poor technique, I do think that has a increased correlation with injury risk. Fight me. All right. So anyways, how do I select weights? So I like to choose weights that allow a consistent expression of technique over time, similar to what we set up as that acceptable range in the beginning. And it's a range. You don't have to hound your trainees, or you don't have to beat yourself up over having slightly off technique. But be aware that if your technique is significantly off, you might be not developing the intended muscle groups that you really want to train, right? So for instance, a common example that we see is maybe rounding the back in the deadlift. What that does is it can shorten the joint moment forces needed to be created around the hip to extend the hip joint, right? So by rounding the back when picking something up, you're lessening the amount of force that your hip extensors need to produce to finish the lift. So the way that I would present this to a trainee is not necessarily that you're going to explode or something bad's going to happen, but it's more just that if you round your back all the time in your deadlift, you might be underdeveloping your glutes, and then your glutes and hamstrings might not develop at the rate that your other muscles will. So then you're going to over rely on other muscles, and that'll create a long-lasting technique deviation in the way that you may actually need to reduce your load in order to reestablish a more optimal technique. So you want to make sure that you're not deviating from optimal technique so significantly that you're developing the wrong muscle groups. That's really the main point of contention that I like to point out when assigning weight selection, assessing technique. Are you still in that acceptable range? Are you really still creating the desired training effect? And that's the main thing that I want to focus on when talking to trainees, and that can help really reduce their threat perception of exercise and lifting weights in general, and that'll make them feel less threatened and improve their adherence. And long-term adherence is really the most important thing. It can be accomplished a bunch of different ways, so we want to really hone in on each individual client's talking points and figure out what's going to give them the best chance for long-term adherence to exercise. All right. Drop a question down below if you want any more clarification on how do I select weights and monitor technique over time, and why, how do I rationalize some of those things that I just mentioned. And I can go further in detail if there's anything that you felt like was left out. Moving on, third question. How often should one exercise? This leads me to believe that you didn't watch my other videos, because I did talk a good amount about frequency, but let's start. Let's do it again. So, how often should you exercise? I like to start off new trainees resistance training about 2 to 3 times a week. I find that's optimal. Usually the first training session, even with really light weights, moderate loading or unloaded bodyweight movements, it can still elicit a significant pain response with soreness, especially with average size to more overweight individuals, especially with a lack of athletic training background, or just even with previous athletic training. If you're currently untrained, getting back into training can be somewhat painful. So maybe for your first few weeks, you might only lift twice. And then after that, maybe 3 times a week. And having that 3 times a week exposure is going to help you develop your technique faster. may not be the most beneficial if you feel like you're just beating yourself into the ground and you can't recover. So that's why I like to titrate up that exposure over time. In terms of number of sets, I like to assign anywhere from 10 to 20 working sets per body part per week. But a new trainee would be hard pressed to do 20 working sets per body part per week all at once. So you want to start all your body parts at about 10 working sets per week. That's 10 hard working sets per week, distributed throughout the week to optimize for recovery. And you can add in a couple sets per body part per week on your weaker body parts. So don't go all the way up to 20 body parts per 20 sets per body part per week all at once. You want to start at around that 10 range and work up slowly. The reason is, if you were to try to do, let's say, like 80 working sets per week, so you're doing like 20 sets for your biceps, triceps, chest, like legs, all of that stuff, 20 sets for every single body part, you might be overtraining your entire body. So we have to consider how much can each body part tolerate, and then how much can your entire body tolerate without facing the negative effects of overtraining as far as impaired recovery, decreased strength output. And once you get to such a high training volume that your performance is declining in the gym or wherever you're training, you really have to ask yourself, why is your volume so high? Because then you're not making the most out of your training sessions, and you're probably exercising too often. Most viewers aren't going to be exercising too often, so I don't want you to watch this and view it as a cop-out and be like, oh yeah, Ian said I'm working out too often, I better just do less. It's like, oh, well, if you're only lifting 2 or 3 times a week and you're sleeping and eating well, the odds are that you're probably not training too much. But with 3 really hard training sessions, if you're doing more lifting along the lines of powerlifting training, something where you're doing your heavier ranges of the intensity spectrum with lower repetition sets, you may not want to lift as many days per week. I know a lot of higher level powerlifters, they don't get enough lasting stimulus from only lifting 3 times a week, so they will lift with fewer numbers of working sets, but more evenly distributed throughout the week. So maybe they'll lift 5 or 6 days a week, but they're not doing very many working sets on each individual day because their working sets are so difficult. And that is another strategy. So there are higher frequency approaches that you can take to this. And I think those generally require a greater deal of auto-regulation in terms of your weight selection. They're going to require you to, on average, use more of a rate of perceived exertion scale to monitor your training load over time. And as a result, you won't be forcing yourself to hit weights that seem unreasonable on a day-to-day basis without being well recovered. You're more focused on the long-term training effect over weeks and months than you are worried about day-to-day performance, as long as you're not focusing on a competition. Hopefully that addressed your question in terms of exercise frequency. How should you space out your number of sets throughout the week evenly? And yeah, if there's any more questions that you felt like I didn't address, any more points in there, drop a question in the comments below or message it to me directly, and I'll answer it in the next video. Once again, thank you for watching. Make sure you leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see my future videos. All right, thank you.